Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the October 5th budget session of the Bellingham City Council. We're going to be going over a budget item today, and as customary, I will now turn the budget session over to the Chair of the Finance Committee, Council Member Pinky Vargas.
Thank you, Council President. Today we are going to be reviewing our police budget, and we're going to start with an introduction from Mayor Seth Fleetwood.
Just like that. Just like that, I'm on. Good to see you, council members. This first of our, what will be a series of budget work sessions throughout the fall. As you know, we started off this year with considerable economic uncertainty, given the downturn in the economy pursuant to COVID, when I think we anticipated starting the year off with a more conventional, robust budgeting planning process where we probably anticipated growth. Instead, it was the opposite. So I remember going through this as a member of the Whatcom County Council and the Bellingham City Council 10 years ago. So some of the lessons learned then were applicable to now. As you know, we've settled upon a prediction for what we think the revenue shortfall is going to be for next year. We believe that it will be a 7% reduction over 2019 numbers. And as it relates to the general fund, that required us to find a solution to a reduction of about $6 million. As you know, throughout the summer, we went through an exercise with department heads where we asked them to identify 5% in cuts, 10% in cuts, and 15% in cuts, just so we could be ready. We're fortunate in the number that we've identified as a prediction for 21 is closer to that 5% exercise. Different department heads offered up reductions. We found some way to close that budget gap through that process. As you know, we've frozen 17 vacant positions. We're going to find considerable savings in 2021 through that. You recognize that we started the year off with healthy unrestricted reserves, around $16 million. We were able to maintain our level of service throughout this year because we were able to utilize our healthy reserves. Again, I give credit to council members for your fiscal discipline in years past, and former Mayor Kelly Linville for putting us in a fortunate and healthy economic position to begin this crisis. So we've gone through about $6 million this year. Our anticipation for 21 is using about $1.8 million. We're proposing furloughs through 21 and some reductions in what would otherwise be higher COLAs, and here we are. So we handed it off to you officially on Thursday. I want to commend staff for doing a lot of hard work in putting this together. I feel that it's a responsible budget given the reality of the times that we're in. It's a budget that is responsive to heightened levels of appropriate concern and consciousness on issues of race and justice. There's lots of money, millions of dollars in this budget to address issues of homelessness, mental health, behavioral health, domestic violence issues, and money to continue supporting our social justice partners in this important work. We also have money in this budget that will allow for a work plan to address the 911 co-responder program and work that was proposed by Councilmember Hamel and supported by the entire council. We'll look forward to coming back with you and sharing with you the work that we've done in that regard. This budget is doubling money to the GRACE program. We are going to be adding $100,000 a year to supplement the work that we do on climate and reviewing the climate action plan and the task force recommendations, identifying the high priorities and creating detailed implementation plans so that we can increase the rate at which we make meaningful progress in our ambitious decade-long plan for real progress locally in converting to renewable energy. This budget is optimistic in many ways. We continue to be able to fund a robust parks and trails program. We've got lots of projects going on the north side of town, trying to create a more equitable response so that we have regionally balanced parks and trail systems throughout Bellingham. Lots and lots of money in sort of the core work that we do. I think people forget that we are a service delivery organization. We provide high-level public services, essential public services to the people of Bellingham. And so there's lots of money in this budget for roads and sewer and water, et cetera. All of the important work that is absolutely necessary to making our collective community work in the best way it can for the public good. So I understand today we're going to have a conversation around the police budget. I think before we hand it over to Chief Dahl, however, I'd like to hand it over to our budget manager, Forrest Longman, who's done a really good job in helping put all of this together. He and Andy, our finance director, have been monitoring the reality of the economic situation for months, every day, and very thoughtful about how they engaged in their predictions. So thank you, Forrest. At this time, I'll hand it over to you.
I'm very sorry about that. It just crashed on me and I just got it open again. So please bear with me for a moment while I get this set up here. Sorry about that.
It's all good. It's been one of the important things we do throughout the year. We take
yeah. Okay. Let me share my screen. Here we go. There we go. All right. Sorry about that. So this is just a presentation to give a high-level overview of the budget. I'm going to walk through some of the details of the budget, and then also walk through the budget book, some highlights of the budget book to help go through that, and then we'll go over the schedule for the budget going forward. So, as the mayor mentioned, this was a very challenging budget to prepare. As you're all aware, this has been an unprecedented year financially. Economic data has been extremely volatile, and there's been a high degree of uncertainty of what our economic future might hold. So as a result, we built a budget that is responsible and responsive, that prioritizes retaining services and the workforce, reallocates existing resources to emerging needs, but is also essentially is a one-year budget. And there's so much volatility and so much uncertainty that continuously monitoring and adjustment of this budget is going to be needed as the economic situation changes. So due to the economic situation, much of the budget process was focused on cutting costs. There were a handful of areas where we were able to reinvest or reallocate resources. So that includes eliminated one police officer to double our investment in the Grace program to $280,000. Additionally, the police department will shift 3 officers to behavioral health officers. We added $100,000 a year to accelerate our climate action. And there's $139 million of capital programming in this biennium to keep our infrastructure up to date and keep on the replacement schedules we've been on. We're also maintaining all of our human services and homelessness programming, which totals well over $5 million a year. The next few slides are intended to give a flavor of how the city's money is used and the constraints that we're working with. The chart on the left here shows that of our total $664 million budget, only 26% is general fund. That's the only money we can use for basically whatever we want. The rest of the money either has legal or policy restrictions on how it can be used. So an example of a policy restriction, 30% of our general sales tax revenues are directed to the street fund. This is a long-standing council determined policy. Those funds can only be used for street operations and capital to ensure that we are maintaining a good transportation infrastructure. That's important, and that's a policy direction that council has set. An example of a legal restriction is something like the water or sewer system revenues. Those are fee-based revenues, and they can legally only be used for the benefit of the water and sewer systems. So that's that other 74% has those various restrictions on it. The chart on the right shows how we spend our money citywide. You can see the vast majority goes to salaries and benefits and capital and maintenance. 10% goes to interfund and 15% goes to other expenses. So then looking a little deeper at the general fund, the chart on the left shows the breakdown by department. So we can see 63% is public safety, with a little further breakdown of how that goes by individual department. 18% is parks, museum, library. 12% are internal services. So that's the IT department, legal department, finance department, HR. And planning represents 5%. And then the mayor's office and council is about 2%. On the right, we see how those break out by type. So 73% of our budget is salaries and benefits in the general fund. Meanwhile, 12% is interfund charges. And what that is, those are internal city services like facilities, fleet, insurance. Those make up 12%. Those we charge to individual departments to identify what the actual cost of doing that business is. And if council is interested, we can dig in a little deeper to those allocated charges at a later date. But other expenses make up only 15%. So outside of those allocated charges and other expenses, not all those things are malleable. Some of those things are like, $2.6 million budgeted each year for the jail expenses and jail alternatives. About $700,000 in human services investments. Fuel, library materials, safety equipment, office supplies, all those things are represented by that 15%. So that makes cutting the budget without impacting employees very difficult. And this is what we did to try and get the budget to a place where we felt like the city was not overly reliant on the reserves. So we'll be seeking 12 to 16 days of furloughs citywide. That's excluding public safety. We have frozen 17 vacant general fund positions. There's line item reductions in finance, the municipal court, the legal department, and the museum. We have tried to identify places where the money wasn't being spent anyways, so it wasn't harmful to remove those appropriations. We've reviewed and reallocated budgeted staff allocations from the general fund into the development services fund, the technology fund, and the greenways fund in ways that we think are more consistent with funding the people by what they're doing with their jobs. We eliminated one of 2 unfilled information security positions in the IT department that were added in the mid-biennium. We're still going to be moving forward with that program. It will just be delayed. We also removed a general fund transfer to the fire and police pension funds. The property tax levy of $2.4 million that goes directly to the fire pension remains committed. And just to give a sense of what that means for our FTE totals, This is full-time equivalent positions. And in 2020, we have 882 authorized. In 2021 and 2022, we are seeking council to authorize only 880. That's the removal of the security position, information security position, and the police position mentioned earlier. In 2021, those 17 positions are frozen. Just a reminder. So this is getting more into the nuts and the bolts of the budget. This view is the biennium looking at the general fund in the first column, all the other funds, all those restricted funds in the second column, and then both funds in the final column. So what we see here is the beginning estimated reserve balance, what we expect to start with. Let's look at this all funds. This is the total budget. So we think there'll be $241 million in reserves to start. We're expecting $582 million in revenues, and then $664 million of expenditures broken out in all these categories. I'll point out that this other services and charges, that includes a lot of our interfund charges. This is how we pay out our health benefits, premiums go out of here. Additionally, a lot of repairs and maintenance that are really in our capital program, but aren't capital from an accounting standpoint, fall into this category. So those are a number of expenditures that go through there. So we're expecting to use almost $82 million in reserves. The other funds reserve, this $74 million portion of that, is largely related to capital expenditures and those repairs and maintenance. So that's saving up money for a particular purpose and then spending it to fix things up. In the general fund, it's more towards operation. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But we're expecting to end the year with $156 million in all funds restricted and $2.4 million in unrestricted. And that's just that unrestricted reserve in the general fund is really the only truly unrestricted reserve in the city. Now looking at the general fund in a little more detail, we've got the 2020, we've got it broken down by year here. So you can see what the 2021 proposed budget is and the 2022 budget. Remember I talked about earlier, we're really thinking about this mostly as a one-year budget. When we get into the second year, we're gonna have to start thinking about what the economic landscape looks like and if we need to cut expenditures or hopefully revenues have rebounded. The combined 21, 22, and then for reference, this is the revised 19 and 20. I will just note that this ending reserves number here, 20 million, doesn't match with the 23.6 we're projecting for the beginning of 2021 right here. And that's because it's everything that was budgeted. And there's things in there that we don't expect to happen. For example, the JCPenney building, we do not expect that to be expended by the end of this year. That's right here in this capital expenditures line. There's also been a number of frozen positions, and there has been general savings across the city. There's also been a reduction of revenues, as you well know. But at the end of the day, we're expecting that this number is going to be closer to this 23.6 instead of 20.4. That's all reserves. Now, as we look over the 2 years, you see the first year here, we've got beginning reserve, the total revenues, all the expenditures by type, the total expenditures of $83 million in the first year, using $1.8 million of reserves. That leaves us with unrestricted reserves of $7.9 million, $8 million. The restricted reserves, last budget cycle, council changed the policy to a 15% of general fund operations as a restricted reserve, emergency reserve. So that equals to be about 13.9 million next year, which will leave us with 21 or 22 total ending in year one. That carries up to year two, and we can see we start using a lot more reserves, and where you can see the differences here, it's in those salaries and benefits and the personnel and wages, because the furloughs and the freezes only affect calendar year 2021. In 2020, all those positions are back in the budget, all that funding, which puts us using quite a bit of reserves and ends with around 2.4, which we think is probably not quite enough. Now, again, there's a lot of uncertainty in the revenues in this budget. And so we're going to be keeping an eye on this and revisiting as we go along. I will also say that these are operational costs that are driving these uses of reserves. In a typical situation, we try not to budget reserves for ongoing expenditures. We try to save it for one-time expenses. That's like, you wouldn't want to, if we use it for operating expenditures in an ongoing fashion, eventually it just gets worn away and then you just have to lay people off. And that's something that we would typically like to avoid. Now, since we think that revenues are going to bounce back up, we think in this situation, this is one of those situations where it makes sense to use reserves. But we'll have to reevaluate that as we go forward. Any questions about any of the last handful of slides before I move on to the budget book?
Forrest, maybe you could remind us what our limit or our minimum amount is that we have to keep in reserves.
Well, so the policy prescribed limit is this about $14 million of restricted reserves there. Now, we would like to keep some reserves on top of that to maintain the city's ability to respond to opportunities and other crises that may come forward. For example, so we don't have the JCPenney building budgeted in this next biennium, but if that were to look like it was moving forward, we would want to rebudget that most likely. We need to have some unrestricted reserves available to undertake something like that. So that's just one example, but it'd be things like that. So we think that 2.4 is probably a little low from a finance perspective, but ultimately it is a council decision. But we would advise a little higher than that in unrestricted reserves, hopefully in the $5 million range as a floor, we think, to be able to respond to things easily.
Anyone else? Any additional questions? Forrest can continue. All right. I think you're good.
Sorry, I don't know if you saw my hand up. I'm trying to raise my hand.
Oh, I can't see all the screens. I was looking at the raise hand automated version. I've got that pulled up on the side because I can't see everyone's screen. So go ahead, Lisa.
Thank you. My bad. I'll bring that up. I just had a quick question as far as the remove general fund transfer to fire and police pension. I'm assuming maybe that's a requirement to transfer funds. I don't know if it's a matching, but is that something that we're going to have to make up in the future? And do you know how much money that is that we're not transferring?
Yeah, it's so we were transferring about $1.5 million of general fund a year, so not inconsequential. So we've been planning to reduce this general fund contribution for a few years, and it lined up at a time when we needed it, which was useful. We've been putting a lot of money towards our pension liability over the last handful of years. There is a $2.4 million dedicated property tax levy that goes to the fire pension, and we've been adding $1.5 million mostly to the police pension for quite some time now. So on the police side, we've got about $4 million of unfunded liability, and that there's about $10 million of cash in that fund. On the fire side, we have about $6 million unfunded. There's about $16 million in that fund. In the police, there's 10 people on that pension. There's more on the OPEB or the benefits side. There's about 39. And in fire, we have about 100 people between OPEB and pension. We believe that $2.4 million of property tax will have the police pension fully funded in a year or in about 2 to 3 years, at which point we can direct that funding to likely support that police liability over the following years. And we think that within 5, 6, 7 years, those will be fully funded with just that funding source, and the general fund is no longer needed. And happy to provide some more detail on that if it's needed. Just feel free to reach out and we can put together some tables for you. So if there's no other questions on that, I'm going to jump. Oh, I see Council Member Lilliquist.
Michael, yeah, Michael has a question. Yeah.
First, I'm wondering if I should ask a question about the GRACE program now, or wait until we start talking about public safety and police. It's kind of different. Shall I go ahead and ask that question now?
Sure.
Or
It really,
Well, yeah.
can I suggest that we table that for a moment when we get into specifics, Michael? Is that okay? So Forrest can, okay? Thank you.
That sounds good. Okay, so I'm gonna jump into the budget book now. We've had a number of discussions just how opaque the budget is, so I thought it'd be useful to walk through the budget book a little bit and give some direction on some good ways to read it and some good resources on it. So this is just a picture of the website. This is the link where we keep the budget. There's actually budgets going back to 2008 are available online. So I'm gonna click on that. It's gonna open up for me here. Is the website, and here's where the proposed budget is. Open that up. So, simple stuff up front here, the index, table of contents, rather. And then the mayor's budget message. I would direct everyone who has questions about the budget in general to take a look at that. I'm sure all you council members already have. A lot of this is stuff that the mayor touched on his introductory remarks. Next, I'm going to jump forward to page 14, which goes through all the types of funds and all the various funds in the city. We have a lot of funds and it's confusing, and all of them have restrictions in one way or another. I'm going to go through at a high level. So the general fund, we're all familiar with the general fund. That's for our general operations. We've talked about what's in there. Next is the special revenue funds. And these are for funding that has legal or policy restrictions on it. Things like the greenways, real estate excise tax, tourism are funds in this category. Next, we have the 200 level funds, which are the debt funds. And these are really accounting tools, basically, for funneling money to our various debt obligations. The capital projects funds, we only have one. This is the Waterfront Construction Fund. And that is really a holding for our $1 million that we receive annually as a refund tax rebate from the state for our local infrastructure financing tool. So that's for capital projects occurring on the waterfront. And that's where we keep that money for future projects. Next is the 400 level funds or enterprise funds. And those funds operate like a business. They should be self-sustaining. That includes water and sewer, but also includes things like golf and Medic One, and the cemetery fund, things that we hope would maintain themselves through their revenues. Next is the 500 level. That's the internal service funds that are funded through the internal charges I talked about earlier. They provide the centralized services for departments, and funds pay for things like fleet, facilities, computer replacement, radio services. Next up, we've got the trust funds, the fire and police pensions, and then the permanent funds. These are endowments, and we can only use the interest on these funds for specific purposes. And then finally, the PFD, which is its own discrete organization. Next, we'll scroll down, and this is on page 17 of the budget. This is the change in fund balance table. I bring this to your attention because this is the same table that will appear in the budget ordinance with slight modification. It will show the general fund departments when it's in the budget ordinance. But these are the legal expenditure limits that council ultimately adopts. In general, fund managers can reallocate and reprioritize spending through the year as needed in the course of business. For example, $100 that has a line item for professional services can be used instead to buy a desk or something if that's what the department head deems the need. Of course, departments strive to keep the spirit of the budget and the policy priorities, but ultimately, council is giving departments the legal authority to spend this dollar amount over the 2-year budget. So what this table shows is the beginning estimated reserves, what we're guessing, what we are projecting the beginning revenues to be, and then this will be the authorized dollar amount that this department can spend over the 2-year period. Maybe I'll make this a little bigger. These numbers are probably looking pretty small. And then what we estimate the ending reserves to be and how much that reserve changed over the time period and what percent. So, but the key here I want to point out is that this is the authorized expenditures. So after this, we'll scoot down to the next table, which shows the biennial budget by type of fund. So this just gives you another angle of looking at where the activity is happening. And I'll just show one thing here. You know, we see a lot of this use of fund balances happening in those enterprise funds. You know, they're going to spend $45 million of reserves over the 2-year period. And again, that's what we talked about before. That's for mostly capital projects and saving up money to pay for big projects. And we use those reserves. We also see a lot of that in the special revenue funds. That's streets and the transportation fund. So those are what those purposes are for. Next, I'm going to, so that's on page 19, and then page 20. It's just, I just wanted to highlight, this is a good resource for identifying what various lines in the subsequent tables, the fund tables, the department tables I'm going to show next are for. So there'll be all the little individual line items will be rolled up into these larger blocks. And if you're curious what's in there, go into this page and looking at what they are and what the explanation is can give you a sense. So I'm going to skip forward to page 23. Maybe. Oh. To the fund tables. So every fund that is in the city has its own table. Some of them are combined if they're smaller funds or they're sub funds. But for the most part, they're all here. And so you can get a sense of the historical spending here. We've got 3 years of actuals. We have the revised 2020. Now, I'd caution you from using this as a apples comparison to 2021, for example, because 2020, you're only seeing the second year of the budget. And what happens is if there's any remaining expenditure authority after the first year of the budget, it automatically rolls into the second year. So if there was a position open for 6 months in 2019 and the department didn't spend, you know, whatever, $50,000 of its budget because of that, then it goes into 2022. So you're not seeing just the dollars amount that were budgeted for that position in 2020. You're actually seeing part of the budget from 2019 and all of 2020. So it's always going to be a lot higher than makes sense necessarily because it's the second half of a 2-year budget. And this is one of the downsides of a 2-year budget, but it provides flexibility. So you can see each year individually here. And what we've got is we've got the beginning balance that we're estimating, the estimated revenues by type, the total, then the estimated expenditures by type with the total here, and then how much reserves in that particular fund we're expecting to use. That's what this net is. Or you can see in previous years, it accumulated reserves. And then what the final ending balance is, and this will match up here for the starting balance for the following year. And then this number, the ending balance for the whole biennium. Now, you may notice that some of these numbers, ending fund balance, ending reserves and beginning reserves in the actual years don't match exactly. And that's sort of a byproduct of how we calculate those beginning reserves. We look at the cash on hand, then we take out things like the last payroll of the year that actually gets paid into 2021. So we take that out. And at the end of the day, they just don't match up exactly. I'll also say that some of this won't line up exactly correctly with the CAFR either, because that looks at things on an accrual or a modified accrual basis, where we're counting maybe accounts receivable, accounts payable into what makes up a reserve. Whereas this is really on a cash basis, aside from some very explicit known expenses that should be accounted in the previous years, like a payroll. So that's the fund budgets. And now I'm going to skip forward to page 55. And that brings us to the department budgets. Now there's a number of tables in each department section. The first will be the department total. That'll have all the funds, the various funds the department uses. In the police, for example, that's general fund, that's a handful of police special revenue funds that is federal money and asset forfeiture money. And then part of dispatch is in here for the police portion of dispatch, a handful of other things. So this shows you overall what the whole department budget is. But this will also always show these sections, the general fund. And the nice thing about this is it goes into a bit more detail than the fund budget does. You see, instead of just salaries and wages, we get to see what overtime is and what salaries are. Instead of just supplies, we're seeing fuel, office supplies, small tools and equipment. So it gives you a greater granular level of detail there. Not all, if a department has control over an entire fund, if it doesn't share it with any other fund, then it might reference you back to the other fund tables to look at it. But for the most part, the major ones will appear here in the department budgets. So you can see there's a number of funds here. There's the special revenue funds, there's the dispatch fund, environmental remediation. And then we get down to here and we can see the department spending by fund and group. So that gives you a flavor of what the department is spending funds on also. And down here below, we've got an explanation of what each of those groups does, okay? So I've got two more sections to show you. I'm gonna skip forward to the capital section. Now this is the capital budget, the 2-year capital budget and the capital facilities plan. The budget ordinance will adopt this and amend the comprehensive plan to include everything referenced in this section of the budget. Now that's primarily because REAP funded projects must appear in the comp plan to be eligible. And that's how we go through that process. But you'll see the spending by department or division, the spending by fund on capital, and then we'll have discrete projects organized by department. And finally, on page 107 is the FTE tables. And every single position that legally exists in the city are listed on these tables, organized by department. So the departments cannot add a position unless council approves it. And these are the positions that you are approving. Okay. Any questions about anything in the budget book there? Okay. I'll move back to the presentation here. And the last thing I'll touch on before I hand it over to the chief is the budget timeline. So we've got a handful of work sessions on Mondays here from today, October 5th. We got police moving through till November 16th. You can see the departments we have planned. 16th is open as needed, and I think we could probably do one on the 23rd as well as needed. On the bottom, we have the timeline for the ordinances and the hearings. We have to have 2 public hearings on the budget. We have to have a public hearing on the revenue forecast. I will note that the council must adopt the property or tax ordinance on, it must have its second reading, its third and final reading on November 23rd, because we have to get that to the assessor's office by the end of November. And then there will be a revenue forecast that goes with that on the 9th. And then on the 7th and 14th will be the introduction and the voting of the budget ordinance, which must go through third and final before the end of the year. I would just say if council wishes to make changes to the budget, we would ask that they have been proposed and voted on by November 23rd, so that we can produce a clean ordinance in time for the December 7th meeting. Finally, I just note that there were a few typos in the budget book. Most have been corrected in the online version. Most notably of consequence, there was a miscalculation of the public works FTE total. But if you do see any other typos, please do send me a note and I'd be happy to clean those up. So any questions on anything else? And if not, I'll pass it on to the chief.
I don't see anyone's hand up. Dan, no? Okay, just checking on that. And just before we turn it over to Police Chief Dahl, on behalf of council, I just wanted to thank you for being very sensitive to what's happening in our country right now and the requests around defunding the police and putting our funds in different places, and how willing and open the police department has been. So with that, I just wanted to turn it over to Chief Dahl, and so he can present the police budget.
Thank you, Councilmember Vargas. And I am hoping that you see my screen right now that says Police Department Budget Presentation. Is that correct?
Correct.
All right. Thank you very much. I am David Dahl. I am your police chief. Thank you, Council, for your continued support. Especially thank you to Council President Knudsen for your encouraging words during old and new business at last week's Committee of the Whole session. It was an absolute boost of support your police officers needed, especially during these difficult times. Like every city department, every institution in this nation, even this world, COVID-19 impacted our operations in significant ways. Your police officers, along with all of our first responders, do not have the choice of sheltering in place or working from home. They're required to remain in the field and respond to emergent 911 calls. This requires us to construct safeguards and protocols to ensure the safety of our employees, as well as the community we serve. Even though many in our community stayed home for several months, our incoming 911 calls are projected to show an increase over the past 2 years. Some of our work plan objectives for 2020 were also placed on hold while we weather this pandemic. But one important achievement that we continue to move forward was our reaccreditation with the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs, referred to as WASPIC, that's WASPC. WASPIC oversees this nation's longest serving state level accreditation for law enforcement agencies. You and our community can learn more about this program at their website, waspic.org. Being accredited certifies that your police department meets or exceeds the 137 standards, which are industry best practices considered for law enforcement agencies in this state. Previously accredited in 2016, we're very proud to achieve reaccreditation and work daily to ensure we continue to meet all of those standards. Council, as you know, we also run the county's 911 Public Safety Answering Point, or WATCOM. By this year's end, WATCOM will become fully functional to receive text to 911 calls from the public. Also called Next Generation 911 or NG 911, this paves the way for our dispatch center to receive text messages, and in the future, images and videos from the public. This has been years in the making and provides another avenue of essential communications, especially for those who may be in danger and unable to speak on the telephone. An additional program that we began building through community collaboration is our first gun buyback program. This program is designed to purchase firearms for destruction. The funds are privately raised, with the payment amount varying by firearm type. Like all guns that we confiscate, they are destroyed to avoid returning back to the street and causing potential harm. The launch of this incredible program has been placed on hold due to COVID, and we look forward to starting it back up once again once we get through this current health crisis. We will provide you with a future council presentation when this program comes to fruition. Here's our proposed budget, sections of our proposed budget for 2021 and 22. Council, you'll notice right away that this budget does not reflect the significant cuts of your police department some have been demanding. I will address this later in my presentation. This budget does reflect continuing essential public safety services to all of our community, while also being responsive to the needs of some of our most vulnerable populations. I will address specifics in a moment, but you will notice the elimination of one commissioned FTE, the funds of which will be diverted to social services, and an additional temporary freezing of 4 commissioned FTEs to help weather the financial storm caused by COVID-19. In regards to the major budget changes, to help support additional options for responses to those who suffer from mental illness or drug addiction, this budget includes the elimination of 1 FTE police officer and transferring those funds to the GRACE program contract. GRACE stands for Ground Level Response and Coordinated Engagement. This increase from the police budget will result in the cities doubling their contribution to GRACE in an effort to establish additional services, which may include unarmed responses to those in crisis. Additionally, I will commit to increasing our behavioral health officer program from 1 behavioral health officer to 4 during the coming year. Council, you'll recall the success of our behavioral health officer program as presented to you on September 23rd last year, and certainly our stated desire and need to increase co-responder outreach to those in crisis. Since we began our behavioral health officer program in June 2019, over 250 referrals have been made for those needing assistance, and that was just with 1 behavioral health officer. I'd like to take a moment and share a couple of success stories reported by our current team, which includes behavioral health officer Zach Sarad and civilian intensive case manager Laura Woods. A subject called 911 approximately 1,153 times from May 2018 to June 2019, mostly due to his behavioral health issues. The behavioral health team was able to work with the apartment management and family members to get him moved to a more appropriate facility, better equipped to handle his behavioral health concerns. This outreach and problem solving was achieved within just a few weeks of our behavioral health program starting. Another is a subject who had numerous 911 calls and arrests, worked with the behavioral health team, and is now being accepted into a college program with full scholarship and housing. He plans on becoming a substance abuse specialist for those suffering mental health and addiction issues. That's an amazing story. Another is a subject generated dozens of 911 calls to include over 50 police reports in 2019. She typically reported delusions or being in a crisis that ultimately prompted Bellingham police patrol officers to respond. The behavioral health team was able to set up meeting times with her on a consistent basis for check-in. As a result of this support, she only has 6 reports this year. Most of them are from the behavioral health team documenting transports, helping her to doctor visits and their check-ins. Also, prior to June 2019, if an individual was booked into the Whatcom County Jail, they were not checked in on by Bellingham Police unless it was for a criminal matter. Now, our behavioral health team does jail visits that allows us to check in on people that are in custody. We also work closely with the Whatcom County Behavioral Health Team and release specialist. This is also very comforting to family members whose loved ones have been booked. Council, I'm certain that with additional dedicated staff for this special outreach, we can continue to make significant positive differences for those needing critical care due to mental health and drug addiction issues. And this will be done with existing FTEs. Also, Whatcom County has requested an increase in funding for the Crisis Stabilization Center, which comes from the police budget. A functioning stabilization center is a key element in helping those in crisis, and the increased contribution will assist in that endeavor. Having a place to take people in crisis is critical, as we all see on our streets the impacts of decades in decreases in funding for mental health care. Last year, I read a sobering statistic in an op-ed written by a police chief addressing this crisis. He stated that in 1960, our US population was 160 million people. And then we had 600,000 hospital beds dedicated to mental health. Today, we've more than doubled that population, 328 million, with only 60,000 hospital beds dedicated to mental health. We've gone from 600,000 to 60,000 hospital beds dedicated to mental health in the United States. As a result, severely mentally ill people are left without care, and many eventually become the subject of a 911 call. That has left your police officers acting as default social health workers and our jails as default mental health facilities. Council, this isn't the fault of law enforcement, but law enforcement is left answering the call as no one else is available, especially at 3 o'clock in the morning. This isn't right, and we're glad to be working in collaboration with others to help solve this societal problem. But the answer is certainly not to cut and redistribute the police budget. Even stakeholders in the social health field agree that this is not the answer. They have told you that during previous council presentations regarding co-responder models. And I want to take a few minutes and address how significant cuts to our budget that some in our community have been demanding would change the level of services we currently provide to all of our community. If I thought these cuts would serve our community's best interests, I would recommend them. However, if we did this, our community would be at greater risk and your police department would become primarily reactive. Just a few days ago, Council President Knudsen stated, "We have community policing here in Bellingham." And he's absolutely correct. Community policing has been our organizational philosophy since the 1990s. The cornerstones of this philosophy include community partnerships, leading the efforts of community problem solving, and continuing to change this organization to meet all of the community's needs. Significant cuts of your police department's budget would eliminate our outreach services, which include our outreach officers, our civilian code enforcement officers, civilian camp cleanup coordinator, district resource officer, and our behavioral health team, which consists of one police officer and one civilian intensive case manager. These dedicated personnel are unencumbered by responding to immediate 911 calls, which allows them the time to engage in strategic problem solving, time to understand the root causes of identified problems, and time to collaborate with the community on responses. These groups contribute to reductions in 911 calls for service. And I want to make just a couple brief comments regarding encampment cleanups. Please remember, the cleanups are a City of Bellingham multi-department response, not just police. The cleanups result from complaints concerning health impacts and hazards, environmental impacts and hazards, and safety impacts and hazards. The City of Bellingham does not engage in sweeps, as continues to be inaccurately stated. And we stand by to provide additional information on those processes at a future council meeting at your request. Significant cuts of your police department's budget would reduce our investigation staff. Those are commissioned officers who follow up on serious crimes, domestic abuse cases, sexual assault cases, internet fraud cases, internet crimes against children cases. Significant cuts to your police department's budget would diminish our abilities to perform extensive investigations of serious vehicle collisions, vehicle fatalities, safe mitigation of critical incidents, and local and regional responses to hazardous devices. Significant cuts of your police department's budget would eliminate permanently bicycle patrols, special emphasis patrols, and reduce our overall staffing levels on uniform patrol to a point where any proactive time would be eliminated. Council, we staff our patrol division based on actual workload and at a level which allows your uniformed police officers time to engage in proactive patrols to keep our community safe. This is especially critical during this pandemic, as considerable time is spent ensuring safe response, operations, and a thorough cleaning after each and every call. Simply put, significant cuts of your police department's budget would change our organization from community policing to simply a reactionary force. I believe our organizational philosophy, operations, and the proactive partnerships we have with our community has contributed to a third consecutive year of decreases in our overall reported crime. This is according to yearly crime statistics reported by Washington Association of Sheriffs and Police Chiefs, as well as the Federal Bureau of Investigation. With all that said, we have heard the call locally, regionally, and nationally for change and improvements in all aspects of the criminal justice system. As I stated earlier, an essential element of community policing is organizational change to meet all of our community's needs. It is very likely that our proposals here today will not satisfy everyone or be enough for everyone, and some will state that they are too small to affect any meaningful change and that more is desired. Our proposed budget balances our need to continue delivering quality and essential law enforcement services to this whole community and demonstrate our commitment to enhancing services to our most vulnerable community members. Our work plan for the next biennium begins by recognizing we are still in a pandemic, and our primary objective remains providing essential services to our community. Along with all that, we're facing a senior workforce with increasing members of our department reaching eligibility to retire. Council, in the next biennium, 22% of our commissioned personnel will be eligible to retire. Currently, 18 officers can leave. That increases to 26 in the next biennium. In the last 2 months of this year, 3 officers retired and additional retirement has been announced this month. It is not surprising that the current anti-law enforcement climate is motivating people to leave this noble profession. We see this nationwide, and I'm hearing this from my own personnel. This is why your support, your continued support, is so critical. Attrition means we may see some delays in assigning to specialties positions, as my main priority remains keeping our uniformed patrols adequately staffed. We currently have new hires at the Police Training Academy in Seattle, and we have others waiting to attend. Academy classes, as you can guess, have been limited with restrictions due to COVID. Now, the impacts we face from attrition also provide us with opportunities to continue our recruiting efforts in attracting, training, and retaining a diverse workforce that strives to be representative of the community that we serve. Due to reductions in general fund revenues, our work plan includes the temporary freeze of 4 commissioned positions to help offset those reductions. All this will be impactful, but I remain committed to filling additional behavioral health officers as the coming year progresses. Our BHO program has been a success, and increasing positions was your interest last year and is our interest as indicated in our strategic plan. Co-responder models like our behavioral health program and the fire department's community paramedic program are making significant impacts on reducing repeat calls for service and providing essential care to many in our community. Finally, we look forward to collaborating with stakeholders in making meaningful changes to our criminal justice systems. We've always been a learning organization, and that we continue making sincere commitments to openly reviewing our practices and seeking better ways to do things. This is why we work hard to maintain our state-recognized accreditation. This is why we meet monthly with the Community Advisory Council and a local civil advocacy group. We've been engaged with regional legislators as they seek data-driven best practices to promote criminal justice system improvements. And Council, we've always been available to you and our community members, available to discuss your ideas and your vision of how we can make Bellingham safer for all of our community members. It's important to remember, it's important for all of us to remember, changes that come out of those processes do not happen immediately or automatically. They unfold over time, follow a thoughtful pattern of steps, and must be supported. Council, your police department is committed and dedicated to moving forward to serve all members of this community. That's my presentation for you today.
Thank you, Chief Dahl. And if you could just take this slide off the screen and I'll get everybody here so I can visibly see. Mayor Seth, did you want to make any additional comments before I start questions, or should I start with council?
Take it away.
Okay. You can go ahead and put your physical hands up now if you'd like. I can see you. All right, we'll start with Councilmember Lillquist.
Thank you, Pinky. I'm going to go to that Grace question now. I really do appreciate the city significantly doubling our contribution to the Grace program, but that is a county-wide program. Is the county government similarly increasing its contribution and expanding that program? What is the overall funding and program expected to be for the Grace in the coming biennium?
If that's for me, Councilmember Lillquist, I do not know what the county's contributions are. And I would strongly recommend that we have Grace leadership team give a presentation to council and give you that information.
I think it's best if we all make these decisions in context. And I think understanding the county's plans for Grace is part of that context. So if the council agrees, I would like to hear either from the administration or from somebody on Grace before we vote on the budget.
I'm happy to set up that presentation, Mr. Lillquist.
Thank you, Mayor Fleetwood. Next questions, go ahead and raise your physical hand if you. Councilmember Hamel.
Thanks. I didn't think you could see my blue hand, so raised. So okay. Well, I've got a few points here. So the 4 items that were outlined here in the presentation today: increased stabilization center funding. It's modest, but it's something. 3 more BHOs. That's huge. I advocated for that over a year ago. Doubling Grace to 280. It's a step in the right direction, but Councilmember Lillquist is correct that county's got to be, they have to come to the table on this one as well. I'm on the task force. I'm on the Incarceration Prevention and Reduction Task Force. We just had a meeting, our main meeting this morning. What I heard is a lot of enthusiasm around these programs. I'm not going to speak for County Executive Sadu, but I did hear some positive things. And then the 4th item, which is the co-responder 911 line item, that commitment to that. These are significant, I wouldn't say sea change, but darn close to it when it comes to acknowledging the issues that our community is facing when it comes to behavioral health calls. Council, I want you to understand that the GRACE program is sort of the umbrella that Prosecutor Eric Ritchie's law enforcement assisted diversion program, it'll live under the GRACE auspices. That's important. That LEAD program, law enforcement assisted diversion, my understanding is that has 3 years of funding from Department of Justice. That's 5 new case managers out there on the streets that can be working with individuals. That's a huge step. And because the LEAD program, it is through the county, but because it is also a social contact program, it doesn't require a law enforcement referral. That's huge. That means a social service provider can refer a person into that program. I guess my questions, so those are my comments. My questions are for Chief Dahl. I think that this BHO, increasing that to 4 from 1 is huge. It's going to impact people's lives. I've gone out with Laura Woods, who's the case manager, and Officer Sarad, who is the police officer, the BHO, and saw a lot of really good success stories. My question would be, how do we continue to make Bellingham and Whatcom County leaders in these types of programs? So are these full-time BHOs? Will they receive additional training beyond the extensive training that our police department gets? Are there expectations on education or background or experience for these positions? Those are my questions.
Well, thank you for those questions. Those are good questions. And in regards to training, I can tell you a little bit about Officer Sarad's experience. And I do not believe he is degreed in any kind of social health services, but I know that Laura Woods, our intensive case manager, helps to provide that expertise. And that's really the key for the intensive case managers. And she's embedded into our police department. So she actually physically works here and at times goes out on the street with Zach to go contact people with meetings. But so far this year, he's attended, or since 2019, 21 hours of crisis intervention at a conference that's held along with the Washington State Mental Health Summit that he attended. Now, the State Criminal Justice Training Center has several different crisis intervention training courses. And guess what? They got canceled because of COVID. So we had Zach scheduled to go to the 40-hour course, and he will go there as soon as that opens up again, along with others as well. But he's attended local training with NAMI, which is the National Alliance of Mental Illness, and of course, training through GRACE. I also want to mention that this is something that we talked about in the GRACE team several months ago, and that is that we have several different departments in Whatcom County that are starting to select people to be what we call behavioral health officers. So I know that GRACE is actually working on creating some good training, not only for these folks on specific subjects, such as motivational interviewing, trauma-informed care, de-escalation, suicide prevention, crisis response, just to name a few, but also to open up that training to our entire community on an online basis, which I think will be very, very helpful. In regards to Bellingham Police leading the way in terms of training, thank you for saying that, because I can tell you that I talked with our training division, and along with legal updates, use of force training, officer wellness, our police officers have about 42 additional hours of training every year that deal in the world of de-escalation. Now remember, the state only requires 2. And the state puts out an online 2-hour course every year. And those are good courses, by the way. Back in 2019, they did a 2-hour course on autism spectrum disorder. It's a great course. It's very visual. Obviously, it's online. It gives examples, gives behaviors, and gives officers the proper response tools to help people who suffer from autism spectrum disorder. This year, it was about traumatic brain injury. Someone who falls down and whacks their head, and the behavior that occurs after that, went over that. It has some really, really, really good training. So the state does a pretty good job. We're doing a good job. And something else that we got this year regarding de-escalation training is, as you know, we purchased a simulator. And I will invite all of you, spoiler alert, Councilmember Hamill went in the simulator. I won't tell you what the results were. He came, and it basically is a movie screen around you that responds to your commands. And it's a very much an eye-opening experience if you want to walk in the shoes of a police officer in a very highly stressful event. So I think that we are doing a lot of work, not only council in serving our community, but I want to talk about training and serving our officers as well, because we're taking officer wellness very seriously, providing courses not only in sleep management, stress reduction, but also financial help, and just stresses on the job. So all that, I think, plays a very important role in how we serve our community. I think I may have answered all of your stuff with Councilmember Hamill. Okay.
Councilmember Lillquist? I don't see anyone else with their hands up right now.
I got my hand up,
Oh,
Pink.
I'm sorry. Councilmember Knutson?
I was going to defer to the gray beard, but I'll go ahead. Thank you, Chief, for your comments. I want to, you mentioned something about, did you say years ago we had 300,000 mental facilities in the country? We only have 60,000 now. Did I hear that right?
600.
We had 600 back in the 1960s, and now we have 60.
60, yeah, because I can remember growing up, there was quite a few facilities here, and I have seen the change over the years of this, but I'm really excited about the GRACE program too. I echo a lot of what Dan had to say. This is the beginning of, I hope, something that'll just grow and grow and grow, and it's absolutely really necessary to get the county on board here too. Really, we need to make this county-wide, so thank you.
Councilmember Lillquist?
Age before beauty or beauty before age, Gene? So I would like to say that I have as much hope, not for the GRACE program, but also for a potential co-responder model to augment our 911. So I'm going to end with a question about kind of the status or timeline where we might hear back more from on that from the administration. But I want to point to a philosophical debate that affects the budget and how I think maybe we will see it play out. The philosophical debate I would oversimplify as saying, do we want better police officers or do we want fewer police officers? And they're both ways of supposedly reducing mistakes, abuses, incidents in which injustice or harm occurs. One way is through better police officers. That's the route the city of Bellingham has clearly taken. The idea that we would have dedicated police officers whose primary function has to do with behavioral health interventions to problems. So we do not treat them as criminal issues, but we do treat them as public safety issues. That's the better police officer approach. The fewer police officer approach, obviously, is just simply, let's just put fewer police out there because we don't quite trust what they're doing. And that's what you hear in the defund model. But I think that's also at the heart of what I would like to see in the co-responder model is, as Chief Dahl said, police are often the default social worker. And I don't think they should be. It's nice to have behaviorally sophisticated, psychologically aware officers, but we shouldn't expect them to be two independent professions at the exact same time in a crisis moment. So I do think in the long run, maybe we can have fewer police officers too, once we build up a co-responder model. So in the end, I would say both. Let's have better police officers and use them appropriately and where we need to, but also few officers as we maybe respond in different ways and head off problems with different personnel with different skills. So that's why I'm going now to the co-responder model. Mayor Fleetwood, you were asked to develop some kind of a budget proposal. And as I understand it, what you're really doing now is scoping out the work, trying to even figure out what work we need and what steps would be taken over the next 6 months or year to flesh out what a program might be like, to talk to partners, develop those models. At what point do you think you might be ready to return to the city council with an update or a progress report? And how long do you think this might go on before? How do you envision the process going? Because I don't imagine it'll be done right away.
Right. I think we promised to you a couple of weeks ago that we would come back to you in the month of November with an update. There is considerable complexity around the design of this model. And of course, one of the things that staff will be doing is reviewing models where they have that. But just as, and I believe I've mentioned this to a couple of you, my understanding is that one of the many challenges with the work of, with this particular work is one has to review thousands of calls, and you have to assess them. We have recordings of all of them, and it's necessary to really try and identify what criteria we're going to employ in determining how one is even selected for a diversion to a non-police response. There's complexity around that, just given the various fact patterns one sees. So that's an aspect that is time consuming. And one of the things I look forward to having conversations with, among others, Chief Dahl, in identifying just the method by which we go about gathering that information, because it's very time intensive. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Chief.
Well, certainly the idea of co-responder is something we've been talking about for some time. And many of us are very much motivated in looking at programs like Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon. There are many co-responder models throughout the United States. Cahoots is a very unique one in that it is just simply civilian response. And I think we have to look very carefully at that and see how that would work here in Whatcom County and under what conditions we would want to send civilians. I can tell you that I share some concern about safety, obviously, and there may be a limited amount of calls that we could send somebody to that might not be trained to the level of a police officer just for their own safety. But I need to understand that. And like the mayor said, take a look at the types of calls we're going to. And if you take a look just a moment, go to the Eugene website, Eugene Police Department, and look at their Cahoots tab. They did a research on the current Cahoots program that they have there. And you will find that there is still a lot of co-responding being done with law enforcement for safety issues. The idea that the Cahoots there was diverting 15 to 20% of the calls just isn't panning out in the research that's being done. It's more like about 5 or 7%. Still, that's a good amount of calls, but we do have to be realistic in what that program can do for our community. So it's a lot of in-depth looking, and most importantly, it's what's happening here in Whatcom County, in our community, in our culture. I look towards Grace as being an important group to work through this process with. The people that are on the GRACE leadership team are very knowledgeable and learned about what the resources are that we have here in Whatcom County. And my vision was that we would use the professionals in GRACE to help us to figure out what a co-responder model or a civilian response model would look like.
Thank you. Pinky, can I follow up briefly?
Yeah, go ahead quickly, and then we've got a queue going on now.
Quickly, to the mayor, you said it's very intensive work. I appreciate that. My request is, if that requires additional resources and budget to do that intensive work, I'd be very willing to support that. Thank you.
I'm gonna take a question, and then Councilmember Hamel, and then Councilmember Anderson. Chief Dahl, I'm curious about, and first I wanted to say a little reminder that we did have a presentation by Grace on September 14th. So that's a good place for the public to refer back to a little bit of an overview on the Grace program that was quite recent. My question, Chief Dahl, is around the behavioral health officers. So currently, if I understand the program, that is usually done during daytime hours. And I'm wondering, with the additional 3 behavioral health officers, will that give us coverage for 24 hours now?
I think it will certainly expand our coverage more than what we have right now. We'd have to look at the need for having them out 24 hours. It might be late into the evening and early in the morning, but it depends on what the call loads are like in the middle of the night. So the idea, of course, of having more behavioral health officers is certainly a variety of better coverage.
And my follow-up to that is, I'm curious what if we have an estimated percentage of the calls that are mental health related and not specifically safety related.
I don't have that information off the top of my head right now, but I've spoken to a lot of community groups, and I often tell people that if you were to get in my car and we were to drive from point A to point B, I can almost guarantee you that we're going to hear a call come over the radio that involves some aspect of mental health crisis. I mean, that's how prevalent it's become. But in terms of percentages, I can't give that to you right now. And in terms of the safety factors, we'd have to take a look at the types of calls that we have to determine which may send someone who's not necessarily a police officer to.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Hamel, and then Anderson.
Thank you, Councilmember Vargas. A few items here. So one, I've read the same report out of Eugene Police Department. I don't think I agree with the methodology necessarily with what they came up with. They showed a 5 to 7% actual call response, whereas Whitebird Clinics out of Cahoots program said 15 to 18%. I think they went as high as 21 year. Regardless, I don't think that, I think that they're inspiring, but I think that Bellingham and Whatcom County can do much better than that, given the fact that we are well ahead of that community when it comes to the behavioral health programs and systems that we have. So I had mentioned before about the LEAD program that's coming online. We talked about Crisis Stabilization Center that's coming online beginning of the year, full capacity with an involuntary commit for mental health for up to 12 hours. That's a huge, if they get that, it's a huge step. We also have MCOT, which is Mobile Crisis Outreach Team. Those teams are social workers that are being used by Bellingham PD and Whatcom County Sheriff's Department. Speaking of Sheriff's Department, they also have 2 behavioral health officers. Blaine has a behavioral health officer now. I think that that's going to be more comprehensive across the spectrum. When we think about the other programs, we have community paramedic, we talked about that, 911 co-responder and behavioral health officer program. We have layers of programs that Eugene, Oregon did not have in 1989 when they started this program. Remember, think about what mental health and treatment looked like in 1989 compared to today. I think that's really important that we have that context. As to the types of calls that co-responders can go to, if you look at Whitebird Clinic in Eugene, they work with serious and persistent mental health folks. but a lot of their calls are low acuity calls. So you'd have like a wellness check, for example, that we don't need to send a police officer, or suicidal ideation where the person's not doing anything criminogenic, or maybe they're having an outburst on the street, but they're not harming anybody, but that's just upsetting to that person and to the people around them. Well, do we need to send a police officer to that? I think that's going to come down to the nuts and bolts of the training component with our dispatch. And thank goodness we have the Grace leadership team who has volunteered to put together the architecture for a 911 co-responder model. We have those experts in this community. We also have an expert in the community that was after the Aurora, Colorado theater shooting years ago. That person lives in Bellingham. That person's a clinical director for a nonprofit organization here. I know that we have the assets in this community to build an excellent program. One thing a couple other things before I stop here. Grace does not need to be 24/7. That is a mistake. We would be wasting money if we did that. Grace is a referral program. It's not a response program. If we're going to stick money into, and we're trying to expand hours, it should be through the 911 co-responder model, in my opinion, because I think we can treat more patients successfully and get better outcomes. I'll stop there. Thanks, Councilmember Vargas.
Councilmember, and Chief Dahl, did you want to respond to that quickly?
Yeah, I did. And I agree. I think that it's very important that we use the resources that we have here and understand the culture of the needs of this community and this county.
Thank you. Councilmember Anderson.
I just wanted to thank you for the work that you've done. I do think we've taken to heart what the community has said, but also taking to heart what the whole community have said. In talking with some officers, learning that sometimes, at night, it took them an hour to be able to respond to a house that was broken into where the resident didn't feel safe going in because the other patrol officers were working on site for situations that they couldn't leave. So it's very important that we are investing in more mental health response. I think it's an appropriate shift that we're making. I did want to make a little change to a reference made. I think you said that it was 600,000 beds, now 60,000 beds, not facilities, because facilities hold more beds. So I wouldn't want the public thinking we had that many mental health facilities, because then we wouldn't have a problem, to be honest, because we would have the resources needed provided by the state and federal government. But I also kind of disagree with the thought that as we improve, which I know we will, our homeless outreach and our mental health response, I don't think that necessarily means that we have to reduce our police officer staffing. We are looking at annexation of a couple additional areas of the community, and we need to be able to look at response rate. So if we annex Tweed 20, and we don't have a site there and we don't have officers in addition for patrol, then what we're looking at is someone who might be responding over in Cordata has to get to Tweed 20 for someone breaking in the house. And that's not appropriate to create the right response, is having less people on patrol. And also, we need our police officers to get back to the work of being police officers. We all agree on that, but that also comes with investigation. We talk about rapes that aren't solved, and we talk about major crimes or human trafficking or cyber crime or crimes against children. And part of the issue is when your investigative staff are taxed and they don't have enough resources to take on, we're almost creating a situation like what we do with our social service caseload. People complain about, DSHS and not being able to do their job. Well, they can't do a caseload of 100 clients. It's just not physically possible. So we also have to be mindful that we need to make sure that our police officers are the resource that we need for the entire community, and be able to shift their work, hopefully in the future, to being what they were hired to do for their career. It's better for the community as a whole. And I'm going to strongly advocate that. Personally, I don't think we have enough to be able to handle all the aspects that we're asking them to do. So even if we shift some of the work, which again is very appropriate, we also have to be mindful about, can they get the job done with less? And I don't think so. And I do appreciate the budget work, because we are going to be in some difficult times financially, but I think we were very judicial about it, and listening to the possibility of where these cuts would come from. Personally, I don't want to see those services cut, because those are some of the core elements of community policing. Your bicycle patrol officers, your community liaison officers. I worked quite a bit with them as a neighborhood person to deal with drug trafficking and to deal with other issues that were what I call crimes against humanity. And they were insurmountable in helping create better situations for some of our most impacted community members. And they did it with great heart and effort and success. So I'm really glad those positions are not on the chopping block, because it really would be a travesty to our community if they were. So just a little thought. I do appreciate all the work you've done. And I certainly hope, just a little plug, that we do get the opportunity to work on a gun buyback program. That's something very near and dear in my heart. And Chief Dahl, I'll probably talk to you in the future about it, because I want to make sure whatever I can do as a community member or a city council person can help get that where it needs to go, which is pulling some of those guns away from out of our community where they're maybe not appropriate. Of course, volunteering, but it's a good place to start. So thank you.
Thank you. Officer Chief Dahl, now I think one thing that people don't quite understand in the city of Bellingham is, with a population of 90,000, we actually only have about 160 police officers, which is a pretty small police department. And that says a lot about how well this police department is run. And, you know, obviously we were in a different place last year, and we were looking at bringing more police officers because we are underserved in many areas, like Councilmember Anderson just spoke about. And our overtime was quite high. And I noticed that our overtime has reduced a fair amount in 2020. And I'm curious about the balance of ensuring there's enough police officers and not going way over in our overtime budget. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that in regards to perspective of police departments and cities and where we're at as well.
Okay, well, first, thank you for that, Councilmember Vargas. We have 122 commissioned police officers. And just for perspective, when I started here, we had 69. So we have increased our commissioned personnel. Overall, 189 employees that work here at the police department and the dispatch center. The important thing to remember is that we staff our patrol officers based on call load. So as the calls come on, we put more people out on the street. As the calls go down, we take more people off of the street. And we work for making sure, we've all heard about the 50-50 split. I know we've talked about this many times. We try to staff so that we have enough time for unobligated and obligated time to do proactive work. One of the reasons why you've seen, I think we're way under budget here in the police department, and it has a lot to do with COVID. It has a lot to do with a lot of things that didn't happen this year, that happened in years prior, a lot of events, a lot of ski to see. We had a big, huge concert last year, if you recall. All the parades, everything that we work didn't happen this year. So our officers have not been utilized on an overtime basis for that. We've also, like I had mentioned earlier, this year we've seen actually a 10.7% decrease in reported crime. This is the third year in a row that the FBI crime statistics and WASPIC statistics are showing a decrease in reported crime. So that's helpful as well. Certainly, it's not just the patrol officers that we have an interest in staffing. It's the extra outreach patrol and its investigations, and it's the training. All that comes into play. So we ensure that we staff based on call load, and extra personnel that we have go into specialty positions, especially in investigations. We just lost one of our internet crimes against children detectives through retirement. That's a position we want to replace in the near future. As I mentioned earlier, attrition is going to be a big thing for this department. We have an aging workforce, and we're doing everything we can right now to hire good quality people and get them trained. But you're going to see a little bit of limitations next year as we catch up to that attrition.
Thank you, Chief Dole. And I definitely support ensuring that we have someone who is casing internet crimes and human trafficking, because we are very, very close to the border, and we know that we are a location that is very susceptible to that. And people don't realize quite how prolific this is in our area. So definitely want to ensure that we have that officer. Council members, queue for questions. I don't see Council Member Stone.
Thanks, Pinky. Councilmember Vargas. So a couple of questions. One, to start off with, is a question about the budget for a 24/7 co-responder response. And I don't know if this is directed at Mayor Fleetwood or the financial team, but I'm not fully understanding how that is included in the budget. I understand that it's an unknown at this point as far as what that would require as far as budgeting and staffing. But I'm just curious where that would, right now, where we're looking at that coming from.
Well, staff is going to work on with council members in identifying a model, options that could be considered by the council, because it's a program that's not in any way known at the present time as to what its final supported detail is going to be. The assumption is that after program maturity is happens and is identified, that we would then, to the degree it requires a budget item, that we would come back and have an amendment at that time.
Okay, so that would potentially need to wait till the biennial review, or?
Well, I mean, we can ponder budget amendments at any time. It could be something that is ripe for adoption during the biennial review, if we choose that. It's really a question of when it's ready to go, and what we've identified would be the financial need for that.
Okay. Because then I just want a clarification from Chief Dahl about staffing for the police department. And so my understanding is that 1 FTE is going to be eliminated and 4 are frozen. And so are all of those 5 positions currently vacant?
They are.
Okay. And then with the budgeted positions on page 107, I realize this might not be in that, might not have enough depth for me, but I'm just wondering, like the behavioral health officer and the civilian intense case manager, like I don't see them on the list, and I was just curious where those types of positions fit in.
Well, the behavioral health officer is a patrol officer, and the intensive case manager is an employee of Grace, actually an employee of I think CMAR or Compass Health, one of those. So she's not being paid for by the police department.
Okay. And so in that vein, I was wondering about the behavioral health officers. So if I understand correctly, those additional 3 officers would be officers who are currently employed by the city, who would then be transitioning their work from, if they're patrol officers now or somewhere else, to behavioral health officers, right? Those wouldn't necessarily be new hires. I just want to make sure I understood that correctly.
That is correct. We're using existing FTEs. There are no new hires for this.
Okay, so existing FTEs, but I guess I'm wondering if, and we might not know yet, if those, for instance, the 4 that are frozen, when those thaw out and are able to fill those positions, would those potentially be new hires coming in with different backgrounds and training? Or are we looking to retrain or shift existing officers who are currently employed? Does that make sense?
Right. We're not going to create a behavioral health officer position and then advertise for that to have some, because they have to be police officers. So they would be generalist police officers having to go through the academy. And if we did it that way, we wouldn't be looking at having any additional behavioral health officers for a couple of years. What we're doing is a little bit of department reorganization, in that we had a dedicated anti-crime team that is not staffed right now because we're dealing with staffing patrol because of some vacancies and some retirements that we've had. So I'm transferring that particular group of officers to behavioral health. And maybe in the future, we can get back to having that specialized anti-crime team. But I think that the priority I'm hearing from you and the community is to put those resources into behavioral health.
Thank you. And I can wait on the others if take a break.
I have a follow-up to that. I don't recall where the HOT team is funded out of which budget the HOT team is funded.
The HOT team are employed by the Opportunity Council. My camp cleanup coordinator is a civilian employee. She's paid out of my budget, and the camp cleanup is paid out of a different fund, out of Public Works at this time.
So, Forrest, do we not have a budget line to help pay for that, or can you explain where that comes from?
Yep, the HOT team is funded through a contract for services through the Community Development Division of the Planning and Community Development Department.
So it's out of planning. Is that the CDBG funds? Is that what you're saying, or?
I would have to look specifically. I think.
Actually, I just got a note from Department Head Rick Sepler that it is paid for out of our housing fund levy. So that answers that question, because I know we discussed extending the hours of the HOT team to kind of address what Councilmember Stone was asking for longer hours of longevity. Okay. Councilmember Stone, I don't see anyone else's hands up right now. If you did have another question and wanted to continue.
So this question comes from some of the feedback just from the community. I had a question about Bellingham's SWAT team, and I'm just unfamiliar with what they do and what the funding requirements are to support that division of the department.
Okay, those are existing police officers that are throughout the organization. We don't have a dedicated, that's all they do is special weapons and tactics. I think it will be really good because there are lots of things that we could tell you about that special team, the training that we do, the fact that we comply with ACLU standards in regards to SWAT teams. All of that is a future presentation to council on that team and what it does and how it's deployed, the matrix that is used to determine whether or not it gets sent out. Something like that we'd be happy to do in the future.
Thank you for that.
Councilmember Hamel?
I guess a question for Mayor Fleetwood or perhaps Mr. Longman from Finance. Just wondering, we're talking about some of these programs. Is there additional funding for the Community Development Advisory Board, which scores the various nonprofits' proposals for program support? Do you know if there's an increase for that at all? Amidst our decreasing environment that we're in.
I have to take a look at that. Forrest, do you know off the top of your head?
I do not believe there was any line item increase for that specific purpose.
Okay, thank you.
Which isn't to say that many could not have been reallocated, but I would have to defer to the planning department for that.
Additional questions? I don't see hands at this moment. Anyone else? No? Okay. Chief Dahl, anything else that you wanted to say to wrap up? But thank you so much for this information, and also for your department being very sensitive to our times and the progress that we need to make, but also the that we are ahead of the curve in a lot of ways, and we want to recognize the BPD for that during these times.
Thank you, Council Member Vargas. I had a unique thing happen to me just this last week. I became, well, I'm now the most senior commissioned officer in the Bellingham Police Department, which means I've been here way too long. But what that also means is that I've seen this department evolve in the last 36, going on 37 years that I've been here. And I am so incredibly proud of the work that's done by the women and men who are serving this department and serving all of you. And we all deeply appreciate your support. We all deeply appreciate your kind words. We especially need that right now. And it is our honor to be Bellingham police officers and serve this community. So thank you very much. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to be your chief.
Thank you, Chief. I'm just going to ask Mayor Fleetwood, is there anything else that you wanted to add or anything else that your staff needs to add?
I don't think so. Just as it relates to the request by Councilmember Lilliquist regarding a presentation on grace, perhaps we can have a conversation offline, and further refine what that presentation might be in light of the fact that we presented just 3 weeks ago on it. So I'll be in touch with you, Michael.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Did anyone else? All right. I just wanted to give another little review on our budget timeline. So today, October 5th was police. October 12th, the fire and municipal court. October 19th, parks, library, museum, and planning. October 26th, HR, finance, IT, and legal. November 2nd is public works. And November 9th would be mayor and council. And then we will be starting our public hearings in regards to the budget. If there are no additional, Councilmember Stone.
So if I could just ask one thing, I'm curious if, I know, and I am very appreciative of Forrest's time spent at the beginning of this meeting, helping to sort of outline the budget and how best to read through this. I'm just wondering if there's a possibility of having something prepared for council that specifically highlights line items or funding specifically related to housing, mental health, domestic violence, and those social services. I think of the behavioral health officers similarly, but if there's a way to, because they are moving pieces coming from a wide variety of different funding sources and falling under different departments, if it would be possible to see sort of a snapshot that focuses on those particular highlights.
Hannah, can we wait on those until the corresponding budget meeting of the department that houses those funds? Or do you?
I'm certainly not asking for it to happen now, but to see that before we vote on the budget.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Do that. Yeah.
Any additional comments for the good of the order? I know that addressing the police budget first was a sensitive issue for many, and certainly for our community who are looking to us for leadership. But I want to say that I think that we are doing the right things with our funds and addressing our community and supporting our community as best as we are able under these budget conditions. So thank you to everyone as we work through these budgets together. And I'll sign off until we'll see you next Monday. Meeting adjourned.